Hi, so now we're on page 41 and we're going to learn a new rhythm. It's an eighth note triplet. Triplets come in various types. We might have quarter note triplets, half note triplets, eighth note triplets. The most common that we see is the eighth note triplet. And what the eighth note triplet does is it divides a quarter note into 3 even beats, okay? For now, we're going to always see it with all 3 of those even beats written, and they're always going to be on the same note. In reality, in application in the real world, of course, we don't always group those into 3 even beats, and we don't always stay on the same note. But you'll see when we get onto our piece on page 42, to make it easy, we're going to always be playing a triplet on the same note. So it'll be like... The way we count triplets is, eighth note triplets, is 1 and a, 2 and a. So if you're feeling a quarter note pulse of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and a, 2 and a, 3 and a, 4 and a, 1 and a, 2 and a, 3 and a, 4 and a. Make note that those ands that I'm saying, just to assign a sound to a rhythm, that's not the same and that we have if we're counting eighth notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Those are in different places, even though we assign the same sound to represent those rhythms, right? So when we're counting straight eighth notes, 1 and 2 and is very different from 1 and a, even though we still use and for both. Okay, so those are all mentioned on 41 there, those 3 kind of points that I just mentioned. Actually, the third one, I'm sorry, I haven't mentioned yet. The third one is great. It talks about your right hand. Whether you're playing with your fingers or whether you're playing with your pick, triplets are a great exercise for your technique because you're going to alternate pick. So if you're going down, up, down, your next downbeat would be with an upstroke. So, or if you're using your fingers, you're going to alternate whatever you start with, I or M, the next beat will be on the opposite finger. So if I start with M, it'll go M, I, M, and then I, M, I, right? So it'll sound like. So it's a great exercise for either your fingers or your pick, however you play, or if you do both. So that's worth noting. On the bottom of the page, I just mentioned a few different ways that people notate eighth note triplets. So you're always going to see some kind of 3. Okay, so it can be a 3 with a bracket, a 3 with nothing, it can be a 3 with a slur, and it can be on the note head side or on the stem side. So that's mentioned on the bottom of page 41. So let's turn the page to 42, and let's take a look at our new piece, which is going to be called Threeplay. So Threeplay is a 2-page piece. On page 42, we have the melody or the guitar 1 part, and on page 43, we have the chords or the guitar 2 part. Both pages are a 12-bar blues in the key of D, okay? So on page 42, I wrote a melody that goes over the 12-bar blues progression. Page 43, we're going to learn that classic blues accompaniment that I'm sure many of you have heard before, though. It's a lot of fun to play. We've already encountered a blues in the book. It was our second piece called Halftime, but that was a jazz blues in G, so it was much more complex as far as what you heard behind your melody with my accompaniment. Okay, this is more of a kind of a traditional, we might call it, if I play it this way, maybe a Chicago type blues. And this is the foundation of rock and roll. Elvis, everyone was influenced by this. It was created by African Americans and was really the genesis of rock and roll, and also a huge influence and collaboration with jazz as well. So let's take a look at Threeplay. We'll get into the 12-bar blues later in the book, but for now, let's get into learning the melody and learning the chords in the key of in the D for the 12-bar blues. If you look at this piece, always take an overview. We're in common time. We have 6 systems of 2 measures each, so it's a 12-bar blues. Normally, we would see that written with 3 systems of 4, okay? But to fit it here and not have it be crunched, I did it this way. I did write the chord symbols above the melody on this page, but really you're going to be looking for the accompaniment on page 43. So when you see a D there, it's not this D, it's not this G, okay? It's going to be a blues accompaniment pattern I'm going to show you later. But those are there for your reference to see the way the harmony and the chord progression works in a 12-bar blues. I would also take a look at measures 2 and measure 8 as being careful to count those measures. A lot of my students will not count those measures correctly. If you look at measure 2, we have a dotted half note on beat 1. So the A's, the eighth note triplets, come in on beat 4. If you look at measure 8, we have a D whole note. That's going to ring for the whole measure, 1, 2, 3, 4. So make sure that you always count when we have those longer notes. That's when we have to count. When we have back-to-back rhythms, like if you look at the first measure, it's just back-to-back eighth note triplets, you don't really have to think about the rhythm too much there because it's consistent. But when we have longer notes or notes that go over the bar line like we did in Canción, that's when it's important that you can count internally and know exactly where you are to come in correctly. You always want to play with the metronome or the CD track for now, okay? In addition to mentioning those two measures, I want to point out measures 9 and 10. It just has a big jump at the beginning of the measure. If you look at measure 9, it goes A, G, F, D. But so the beginning is quite a jump there from the A to G. Look at measure 10, G to F. So those are what we call a minor 7, for those of you that are interested in theory. From the A to the G is a minor 7th, and the G to the F is a minor 7th. Without getting too technical about it, if you just count up on your fingers, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, it's a 7th. Because it's not a G sharp, it's a G, it's the minor 7. And with G, if you count up G, A, B, C, D, E, F, it's also a 7th. And again, because it's G to F, not G to F sharp, it's what we call a minor 7th. That's optional, but I did want to point out that that's a big jump, and to be careful of that with your right hand to make sure that you're jumping from the G string to the E string. So that's a good coordination skill you're going to learn there. The only other thing really worth mentioning here, and it's fundamental to this piece, is a new technique to play the notes D and G. If you think about the pieces we've learned so far in the book, the first one that we encountered this on was Countrified, where I went. So I want you to use your third finger and your fourth finger. Also, at the end of the piece, Carnival, I want you to go pinky, okay, third finger pinky. Now I want you to learn a new technique that some of you have already probably been thinking, why can't we just flatten out our finger? So if you take the tip of your third finger, you can see that I'm barring the D and the G at the same time. So I don't have to do this quick hop. I don't have to do this, and I don't have to roll it over. It's just there. It goes. Of course, you could do 3 and 4, but now I want you to learn this new skill. Look at the first fret. We've got F and C. You already know how to do that from our F chord from Canción, right? So here I'm going, so it goes like this if you watch the whole phrase together. So you see how I flatten this out? And I flatten this out. And just in those locations, okay, just when you see that phrase of going D, G, F, C, which does occur in measure 1, measure 3, measure 7, and measure 11. The rest of the time, I want you to arch perfectly and use your normal fingering. So go through, say the note names, practice those problem areas, and now let me play the melody for you. I have the metronome at 80. 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now we're on page 43. Let's talk about how we're going to play the chords behind the melody on Threeplay. As I mentioned before, the 3 chords are D, G, and A. For those of you that are into theory, that's our 1, 4, and 5, right? So a blues is made up of our 1, 4, and 5 chord. Later in the book, we're going to get into diatonic harmony. I'll explain what that means. But if you ever heard the term 3-chord rock, this is what this is based off of the blues. Okay, so we're just using the 1st, 4th, and 5th degree of a D major scale to make our chords. But again, instead of playing D, G, and A, which we haven't learned A major yet, but instead of playing that, what I want you to do is play it with a blues accompaniment. Okay, what the blues accompaniment is, it's going to be the root and 5th of the chord, and then it goes up to the 6th. So we've all heard this sound. But you haven't fingered anything like this yet. So let's take a look at it. Let's break this down. If you look at the notes in the first measure, it goes D, A, D, A, and then to D, B, D, B. Now we do know those notes, but if you play them as you've learned them so far, if you play it D, A to D, B, it just doesn't sound very bluesy. It It's also tricky. We have to use our fingers. It doesn't sound right idiomatically, and it's not the way to play it. So what I did do was I tabbed this out for you. So those of you that are still confused by the tab, remember, you can go back to page 6. But if you look at it, you can see the whole first system is just on the A string and the D string, and it says 5-7, 5-7, 5-9, 5-9. Up above, underneath the music, I put your left-hand fingering, which is 1-3, 1-4. Okay, so for those of you that already know power chords, we're going to get to those later, of course, but here's 1-3, and here's 1-4, as far as our fingers, right? But this is 5-7 and 5-9. Leave your third finger down as you play with your pinky, okay? So this is the first finger on the 5th fret of the A string, our third finger on the 7th fret of the D string. That's on 1 and then for 2 and, we come up to 5-9, okay? The other thing I want to mention, we're not playing these eighth notes perfectly evenly, okay? That wouldn't sound right for the blues if I went 1 and 2 and. You could play it that way, but that's a straight eighth blues. 90% of blues are played with swing feel. So we elongate the first of the eighth notes, okay? So instead of playing, I'm going to elongate the first one. Okay, so it's going to be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and swing feel is explained later in the book, but this ties into our triplet. One way that you can think of it, and a lot of teachers teach it this way, is that swing feel is played as if we tie those first 2 beats of the eighth note triplet together. So if you're thinking of the triplet as 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and da, 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 hit the first and the third beat of the triplet. And that's a good approximation of how to get into swing feel. So this is played with swing feel all the way through. This part here might take you quite a while to stretch. Don't get depressed. Don't get discouraged. You need to practice consistently, daily, for a week or so before you start really, feeling bad about yourself, or don't feel bad about yourself. You'll get it, guaranteed. But this is why it's so important that we play with good technique with everything we play. Even the very first piece we learned, Vamonos, I said I want you to stretch your fingers out. This stretch here is the same as this stretch here. Okay, so as long as we're always stretching out like this, these stretches will become easier and easier, right? Often people ask me, what technique exercises do you have? I said, just play everything with perfect technique as close as you can, and then everything kind of becomes a technique exercise. So here's the first device. It's going to be 4 bars of this, right? For the D. And you count that 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. All downstrokes with your right hand. I recommend using a pick. Okay, I'm not using a pick, but I'm using my index finger as a pick, just coming straight down. Now, in bar 5, we switch to the G chord. Okay, so if this is a D, we just need to do that same shape, but with the root note on G, which is here. Okay, so now the same shape is going to function as our G chord. Back to D for 2 bars. Measure 9, A. The A is on 5 and 7 of the low E and A, but then it's the same exact physical mechanism. So this device is tricky. It's going to take you a while to get that stretched down, but the good news is it's just the same exact thing in 3 different locations. On the 5th fret of the A string, it's D. On the 3rd fret of the low E, it's G. 5th fret of the low E, it's A. So let me play this for you so that you can hear how it sounds. Again, I'm going to do it with the metronome at 80. 2, 3. Okay, so a couple things you may have noticed. Sometimes I was using palm muting. We'll learn that later in the book. You can play it with your hand rested. We'll get into that more explicitly later. Or you can do it from, letting them ring. Sometimes I shortened them. Sometimes I let them ring more legato. When they're longer, it's called legato. When they're shorter or cut off, it's called staccato. That's up to you. What I'm more concerned with is that you change to the harmony at the correct time and that you're playing locked in with that metronome. So important. Okay, so that's our 12-bar blues accompaniment. That is to go as the accompaniment for the melody on page 42. Be patient with yourself. Give yourself a week or two to stretch out. If the transitions are too hard for you, what I would like you to do is to play all the way up, and then maybe the last bit you can play a whole note or you can play a half note. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say that it's too hard to switch from the D to G. So I play 3 bars. So it's always super important that you're actually at the chord change on beat 1. That's more important than playing the actual rhythm all the way through. More advanced people, this is great to solo on with a D minor pentatonic or a D blues scale. We can talk about that later. Okay, so enjoy. So that's 3-play, and we also introduced our 8th note triplet.